of those who are not here with us, it would be great. All right, I think we're ready to roll. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to the Expert Dialogue series. We are glad that you're able to join us this afternoon. My name is Patty Sianga-Knudsen, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon, Vice President of the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. And we're really excited for this series that we have here today with the focus on remittances as we join the world in commemorating the International Day of Family Remittances, which took place on the 16th of June. But as GRFDT, we dedicated the month of June indeed to be able to deliberate using our Expert Dialogue series on remittances. Now, before we kick off, we just wanted to share a short video with you to give you a glimpse into the key message that our president, who is also our guest speaker for today, shared in commemoration of the International Day or family remittances. Professor Binod Kadria, who's joining us as guest speaker, and I'll just ask my colleague to play the video for a minute.
This is a good time to talk about remittances, particularly in the context of the forthcoming events, SDG Summit, the Global Compact for Migration, and the Global Forum on Remittances Investment Development Summit 2023, as well as International Day of Family Remittances. I think my organization, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, better known as GRFDT, is in the right position to take this discourse further and make it useful for the stakeholders. What we think particularly is that we have given enough time and scope for discussion of the levels of remittances and how they are being, or they should be utilized in the countries of destination, and how the stakeholders are involved. But what we have not discussed so far is why. Why should the cost of remittances be brought down below 3%? And why the migrants should try to send the maximum amount of remittances to their families. I think it is important to understand, particularly when there is a conflict of interest between the remitters, the receiving families, and the companies which are actually transferring the money concerned and doing business. One reason is that the cost, to bring the cost down, is that it would increase the disposable income in the hands of the families. And that, I think, is a very important point to keep in mind, because that is going to compensate the companies for reduced profit when they bring down the cost, because it is going to give them a larger market as the purchasing power in the pockets of the families. So that is very important to talk about. The other thing is that we also need to talk about the negative side, the darker side of remittances, because the construction of remittances takes place through reduction in consumption by the migrants on their nutrition, on their health conditions, on their working conditions, and so on. So this reduction in labor productivity actually leads to a reduction in the overall national income of the countries concerned. That's where we need to understand that without reduction in the consumption by the remittances, how the volume of remittances can be increased in the hands of the family. This is something that the GRFDT is going to discuss in the month of June, which is dedicated for the purpose of initiating discussion, research, and brainstorming on the issue, which I think is going to be of much greater importance for the events that are forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you for that playing of the video. I think it was a very important segue for us to understand where we're positioned today, and also to understand that GRFDT is indeed committed in joining the global community in commemoration of this day. But as we commemorate this day, we've got in GRFDT fashion and style, the possibility for us to engage quite differently, if you like, as a think tank and a research institution, but for us to also be able to provide the space for those that may not be able to have the access to the same audiences on the global platform. And here we're talking about migrants and those who continue to contribute to the remittances ecosystem. So very happy to be here today. Once again, for those who are just joining us, welcome to the GRFDT Expert Dialogue Series, where we are in conversation today with Professor Binod Kadria, the president of GRFDT, and he is also a CERC Scholar of Excellence. And just before we will go into it, I would just like to give a bit of background to where we're standing here today, because we realize that others may just be joining us and others may be wondering why this is important, actually, even from our side of the table. So we do realize that indeed the International Day of Family Remittances, as the campaign slogan for this year's commemoration has been coined by the UN system, is around digital remittances towards financial inclusion and cost reduction. And of course, there's a huge amount that is passing through this ecosystem, a huge amount in terms of the financial transactions that are recorded to the volume of 647 million, according to current estimates. And this is expected to increase to probably about $5 trillion in about 7 years. And this is when we will see the sunset close of the SDGs. So that would be interesting for us to keep track. And at the same time, the UN system is trying to use this platform, this commemoration, to raise the greater awareness around the impact of remittances, and not just for the millions of migrants and their families, but also the communities and also the countries of origin. And so indeed, there is that link between the Global Compact on Migration and the commemoration, as the Global Compact for Migration Objective 20 is very much on the cost reduction in terms of remittance costs, in terms of the transfer costs that remittances continue to attract for a large number of migrants, and excluding many from that particular market as well. And so we have just shared with you the video that GRFDT joined in the IDRF campaign, but at the same time, not too long ago, in the beginning, in the month of June, the world gathered, and we're saying the world because it's a large section of the remittances industry and community, those who talk about remittances from the private sector, government, civil society organizations represented by diaspora and migrant organizations, but also private sector players who joined in the Global Forum on Remittances, Investment and Development that took place in Nairobi. And GRFDT was very glad to be part of the 600 plus delegates that joined from across the board. Now, a number of things and a number of key addresses, very prominent addresses were made here, and you can visit the website to find out a little bit more. For us at GRFDT, what we thought was very important, linked to what came out as some of the primary highlights on this, is that we have continued to engage in this policy discourse. And we just didn't start yesterday, but it goes even in the beginning of how GRFDT has structured itself, because our business at GRFDT is understanding why diaspora engage, but also to understand transnational migration. And so remittances sits very close to our hearts and to the heart of the research. So whether we were looking at some of the conferences that we have held, or the research monograph series that some of you may have had a look at, and all this is available on the GRFDT website, or the training programs in which we have met many of you as well, remittances continues to be very important for us as a space which we need to unpack from its various from the various positions and from various speakers, and unpacking it really in terms of the depth, not just looking at the financial transactions, but the before and the after. Now, the objective of today is really to unpack a much more balanced narrative on remittances. And we want to unpack this remittance story. We want to understand what can be done really to improve the conditions for millions of migrants and their families beyond the remittance tracking itself. So the guest speaker that we have today is no other than Professor Binod Kadria, who's the president of GRFDT. And Professor Kadria indeed holds many hats, and we'll be sharing his bio in the chat as well. He's currently the president of GRFDT, and he's also the co-convener of the Metropolis Asia Pacific. He is an honorary senior fellow and director of migration and globalization studies at the Center of the Multi-Level Federalism Institute of Social Science in New Delhi. He's also a former professor of economics and chairperson of the Z8 Center for Education Studies, the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and many of you may have met him in the classroom as well and engaged with him. And at the same time, he earned his Bachelor of Economics honors from the Cotton College and the PhD from JNU. And he has been a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. And so, apologies, there's quite some activity in my household at the same time. He's also published quite a number of publications, but most importantly, I mean, covering a wide range of papers in many different spaces, from the OECD side, from the point of view, from the even looking at the Harvard International Review. These are just many other spaces, but particularly also the Encyclopedia of Indian Diaspora. And this for us remains an inspiring spot. He has been the co-editor of the World Migration Report of 2020, and also a guest co-editor of the current special issue of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal on Indian migration and development. And this is all important for us because as we will be speaking to Professor Kadria today, he will be really indeed sharing from some of the important spaces and work that he has done. Professor Binod, really glad to have you here. And I wanted to go straight into the first question because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions also from our colleagues. We just wanted to get a better understanding from a migrant's point of view, what these global estimates mean and the impact that the global objective aims for in terms of remittance reduction. And in your viewpoint, where do you see these objectives being critical for migrants, in terms of what they need to provide better livelihoods for their families through remittances? Professor Binod.
Thank you, Paddy. It's always refreshing to listen to you and to meet younger people, my colleagues, and all the other audience in the audience, and reflect on the issues related to migration. And today we are discussing remittances. Thank you for playing that video, which reminds me of my own thoughts. And thank you for asking this question today, the viewpoint, migrants' viewpoint, from the migrants' viewpoint. And it makes me think the reduction in transaction cost, at the moment it's close to 6% and higher up. And the target that has been given by the UN is below 3%. Why? How does it matter to the migrants? That, I think, is a very good question that we usually do not put our minds to. We, I think, look at the macro data, macro picture in terms of the volume of the remittances that are coming to the origin countries. And we just look at their league tables and how they are changing year after year, who is first, who is second, and so on. Well, I think in terms of migrants' point, if the transaction cost of formal transfer channels is brought down, then I would think that this would help the migrants to opt out from the informal channels, hawala market and so on, which may be giving little less in terms of transaction cost, but the uncertainty is very large in terms of losing the entire money and also in terms of waiting periods. So I think the question of security of the transaction of the remitted money reaching its target, its destination to the homes, to the families of the migrants is something which is extremely important from the migrants' viewpoint. And that, I think, is very, very important. And I have already mentioned, as you have played in that video, is that it would certainly leave more in the pockets of the families as purchasing power, which would have a multiplier effect on the market. And it will ultimately come back to the business sector are involved in the transaction of. So it's not one-sided in the sense that it's not charity that the agents are being asked to undertake or provide, but it is in their own interest that they should do it over time. So I think the question of self-interest of the stakeholders, it's a win-win situation. And that's the viewpoint that the migrants should be thinking of. It would definitely help in the reduction of black money. because that black money has its own ramifications in terms of reduction in the welfare expenses that the government can undertake in providing education, health, and other welfare services. So ultimately, it's a losing game. If it's like, it's like killing the goose that lays the golden egg. That kind of situation if we are having higher transaction costs. So I think that migrants' viewpoint is very important. The only question is whether there is a voice to the migrants. That voice has to be given by civil society, by think tanks like the GRFDT, and of course the young scholars who can influence the policymakers through their writings, through their debates, and through campaigns. That I think is very, very important to carry through, particularly when we are celebrating the International Day of Family Remittances in preparation of the SDG Summit in September. So that's what I can say at the moment. Of course, we can see the impact of this in terms of average productivity of labor going up, which at the moment is very low in the south.
Thank you, Professor Binod. And I think you've alluded to a very important issue there of how we rope in the migrants' experience in all our work. And when I was in Nairobi and sitting around all these, important experts and practitioners, from central bankers all the way to people who work around payment systems and how remittances actually move from one space to another, you could not really help. And by the way, there were also awards, for instance, that were given to the fintech industry and sort of the remittance market, but also to players in the international space. And this was particularly for two central banks, the central bank, the Gambia, and also the central bank in Kenya, that got awards for the exemplary work that they have done. And the Gambia was very prompt, Central Bank of the Gambia was very prompt to dedicate its award to migrants and to the diaspora in recognition. And I think that was quite an aha moment for a lot, because often we forget that this billion-dollar industry, which is out there, has actually generated a lot, and the ones that are actually generating this income are sometimes, as they say, there are fewer of them in the room than they are out of the room, right? And so how do we really bring those experiences, even in discourse like that, but also in the space of research, and also making sure that we're working together with civil society organizations and others as we try to talk in the global spaces, in the national spaces, and in the regional platforms of how we can really use these global objectives to steer around a transformation in the lives of people. So thank you so much for that question. Another question that we would like you to just ponder with us is sort of the lessons that you see that we can draw, that we draw from research, or can be drawn from research and working together with civil society. What can that teach us about the lesser known side of remittances? And here we're talking about the dark side of remittances. Where do you see some of these challenges and the social aspects in terms of the pressure that's on the remitter?
Yes, extremely important for flagging these issues and in the right forum. Paddy, I think we certainly, the researchers and civil society can make a mark, and if they are working together, then the collective outcome is larger than the sum of the two independently put together. So I think it's very important to look at by looking at the dark side, the negative sides, the lesser known facts about the dynamics of remittances. One has to go into the process of construction of remittances in the sense, where does it come? Where do they come from? They come from the income and wages that migrants save in the countries of destination. By, at what level? Does it cut down in their basic minimum needs in terms of consumption, in terms of medication, in terms of nutrition, in terms of housing? Are they making big compromises? And to my mind, I think this suspicion is correct, that they want to send the maximum possible amount to their families back home, because their families are not with them. And if that is so, then we researchers should try to put these mechanisms together, how the darker side can be turned into a brighter side by bringing the cost of transaction to an optimum level, and at the same time providing guarantees and securities and insurance to the migrants' remittances, that if something goes wrong, then there is some other agencies, maybe insurance by the government, will take care of that. That would, I think, create the trust that we talk about, the trust in the diaspora, the trust in the banking system, the trust in the government, the trust in the bureaucracy. That, I think, would be the right answer to saying the whole of government. Whole of government does not exist in vacuum. We have to look at we have to disaggregate the government, look at what are its components. To my mind, the government is the legislature, where the policymakers, come up with the policies, and then the bureaucracy, which is the executive, that executes the policies in the field. And finally, what we have not brought in is the judiciary. The judiciary is our, moral guard. That, I think, we have to activate much more and get them involved in telling us what is natural justice and what is not ethical. That, I think, is extremely important. So when we talk of whole of society or whole of government, it should not just start with a slogan and end with a slogan. It has to be understood properly. What are the components, different components, and where are the conflicts of interest that are lying, and how these conflicts of interest could be brought down. That is extremely important to my mind in terms of the role of the research and role of the civil society to create these awareness. And whole of society is not limited to origin countries. It is also the society of the destination countries. That has to be kept in mind. So awareness, education, these are soft options, but their impact is very long lasting. That we have to keep in mind. We need not lose patience that we press a button today and results will be available tomorrow. We have to wait longer time. That is extremely important. So I would say trust, time, and loyalty. These are the three, mantras to be kept in mind if we have to actually leverage the benefits of the action that is being recommended for bringing down the transaction cost. The transaction cost is only one item which is to be handled, but it has multiple ramifications, and you can see how the multiplier effect can impact the entire society. And I would also like to say that when we're talking of whole of society and whole of government, we have forgotten whole of migrants. And I'm glad that the word family is included in the International Day of Family Remittances. That it's not only the migrant worker or the migrant's spouses or the children. This is the entire family which is, the beneficiary or non-beneficiary, I would say, if they are deprived of their rights and their privileges and their due, whatever is due to them for the labor that is lost.
No, thank you for bringing us to, as they say, the soft side of it, isn't it? And I think that this is often the side that we are not recognizing so much. So that there's a lot of focus on the process itself, or rather the financial transaction. But there is so much more that is happening before a remitter has to walk to a booth, use their mobile phone to send remittances. There's a lot happening around creating these kind of conditions, and I think that's what GCM 19 actually tries to look at, what are these conditions that could be conducive so that migrants and diaspora can contribute to sustainable development, looking at, resources that are sent home. And, interesting the way you've unpacked it and sort of the multiply effect, but also talking about the trust, the time, and the loyalty being very key mantras, because these are really the connections. We're talking about family connections, and often we're talking about how there are different remittance strategies also in the same family for looking at different generations. Often it is said the first generation is giving out of obligation or giving out of actually of responsibility. And sometimes there's a fine line between this responsibility and obligation. And the next generation may give maybe from connection to that first generation. And the third one may question a little bit more, might want to even open up a little bit more. I often give an example of my own younger sister, 10 years younger than me, that still asks a lot of questions around any kind of support that has to go home. I mean, often some of us are giving because my mother has said so, my grandmother has said so, a friend has said so. And so those connections and the trust and the loyalty works. Whereas for my sister or a younger generation who may not have those strong ties to the homeland, still have questions about impact and results. And that applies both in the investment space for diaspora investment, but also in remittances where, small investments, small business investments can also be made in terms of trying to sustain and extend the life of it. Now, we wanted to go into the audience and give the opportunity to ask some questions. And in fact, we also have a question for the audience. And I'm glad, Rashid, you have come straight to the rescue. So please go ahead and ask your question. Rashid, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you. I have three remarks, actually. First, what is what are the impacts on the building of democratic culture on the at the local level where the remittances are sent? Because the idea is with remittances also some public goods are being offered, for example, like building schools, but the channels are through families or through there are private channels. And so there is no, let's say, there is no reason then to have a democratic culture and to debate about the allocation of funds. So what is the relation to the let's say to the building of democratic institutions at the local level? This is one point. The second point is, but it's known, but I want to mention it, however, is what are the channels for not documented migrants? They cannot use the regular channels. And is this question tackled that, let's say, it is possible to use official channels even if migrants are not documented and illegal? I think it's important because they must pay more transaction costs and so on, and because it nurtures some, let's say, illegal flows too. And the third point which I want to bring is that shouldn't we compare the remittances from north to south to remittances from south to north? For example, there are many people who finance the studies of their children in the global north, and there are huge amounts of money. And I've observed also that a lot of entrepreneurs rely on resources of the families in the south who send the money when they start up, who send the money to the north. I think this should be clearly showed somehow and compared. Thank you.
Yes, Rashid, thank you for raising these extremely important questions. Yes, the democratic culture in the receiving countries, in receiving remittance receiving countries, is important in the sense that the transfer that takes place, transfer of resources, monetary, financial resources, endowed in the remittances are in families. Yes. Now, the question is, a democratic institution has a role, provided this transfer takes place through formal channels. Even if remittances are not to be taxed, there has been some demand at some point in time that the destination countries are, deprived of these resources because they look at it as a deprivation when they are transferred to the origin, which is ironical, right? Not supposed. But when that happens, that transfer that is the time when the remittances are already, tax paid money. It is after the post-tax resources savings that the migrants are sending back home. So if they are going through the informal channels, then the agents, involved in that hawala market agents, they don't pay taxes on that. Whereas if it goes through the channels, migrants don't have to pay taxes. But what about the business? Corporate tax that is due to the government, that gets lost, that goes into the black market. That's where the principle of democratic functioning of society or state in terms of its revenue and its expenditure on welfare activities gets distorted. So that is where I think it is important that the channels need to be brought back into the fold of formal channels, because informal channels, if they are expensive, more expensive than the hawala market, then people will take resort of them and take the risk, which would create undemocratic institutions and black market, right? Parallel economy, right? That I think is the answer to a very important question about the weakening of the democratic institutions by resorting to the channels, by having higher transaction costs. That mechanism takes like need to understand it. Examples and empirical information. Your second question about undocumented migrants and their their access to formal channels, that is extremely important point. I think this should not be on the basis of whether the status of migrants is documented or not. I don't think it is important if that record, if the records can be faceless, the remittances can be faceless transactions, where you don't have to have because even otherwise, you see that this is happening. If there is an undocumented migrant, he will ask a friend with a documented migrant or a resident or a citizen of the country concerned, who will make that remittance. So there are these kind of ways which can be brought to surface rather than keeping them hidden. It would be again not a charity, to allow the undocumented migrants access to the formal channels of remittances. That I think is important to be conveyed. What are the proportions of these? How many people, what proportion of people or migrant workers or families are undocumented, and how much they can save and what proportion of remittances go to them? That has to be understood. We only talk about, we are just the glamorous data of which countries at the top. So I think it's an extremely important point that we raised at the summit. Finally, this is third point, which is my favorite. In fact, I have been raising this issue for a long time, and I used to call it silent backwash of remittances. It is silent backwash because we talk about it. It is 15%, as high as 15% of the remittances that is coming from the north to the south. 15% goes back in education only, and then you have also mentioned about the startups and other entrepreneurship efforts where the migrants get resources from their own country in local north. So this is important to be projected, we talked about, to be counted, to be estimated, but it is not insignificant. And when we look at the education sector, particularly higher education, foreign students issue, which is a large section of the international migrants, then they bears the cost of their education. 65% of the cost of their education comes from the pockets of the parents, whether their own savings or they are taking loans by paying interest rates, high interest rates, and only 10% comes from the country of destination sources. The remaining 25% comes from third party sources, which are charity organizations and so on. So we need to connect these links and say, what is the construction of the remittances? What are the different components? And how much of it flows back into the countries of the destination? That's an extremely important. Thank you for raising it.
I think, Rashid, did you want to come back before we invite Iman? Did you want to come back?
No, thank you. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks again for that question. And indeed, I was just also thinking before bringing Iman to join and ask her your question, Iman, but the construction of remittances, indeed, right? That where do we really see I mean, in my own opinion, I feel that there's been a lot of focus on cost reduction, which is essentially very important. But at the same time, maybe the agenda has to shift from looking at just reducing the cost on one part. And I think the private sector has, it was really interesting to listen, for instance, to private sector players from the African continent at the forum, but also in many other spaces where they're saying, we all know what constructs the cost. This is the KYC requirement. So is also part of it, knowing your client and knowing your customer requirements remaining very high, but at the same time, a lot of things around the regulatory space as well. That just, so this cost is sort of sitting somewhere. So for us, I think from a civil society space or even from a non-state actor space, it's not just about shifting these profits to another part of the industry, but really, as Professor Binod has said, into increased disposable income for remitters. And this is where you see a growth of the volume. But at the same time, I think there's a very big connection to the before, right? To the decent work, provision of decent work. And decent work goes with skills recognition. Skills recognition sometimes is also talking about legal pathway. And as Professor Binod has said, this sort of this black box or black market jobs that are there that don't really allow then everything to be formalized in that way. So, we've got the turning key GCM5. There are legal pathways that could open up quite a number of GCM objectives for them to be achieved in a much more easier way, as one would say. But it's also one of the most difficult ones, as it may be. Iman, I won't take the floor from you. Please go ahead and ask your.
Thank you, and thanks for the 3 points you raised, Professor Binod. It's quite interesting to be listening to your talk today, and I appreciate the couple questions as well. I just have 2 points to reflect on your last point of the monies going back. I was just looking at the Statistics Canada data today from our last census. And interestingly, the percentage of Canadian non-permanent residents, as they are qualified on the census, is now 2.5% of the entire population. And Stats Canada clearly mentions that most of these people are students who come to Canada for study. And you can imagine, and this is noted as a growing percentage of our population. So definitely there's money attached to that and money coming from south to north. I just wanted to highlight that. With regards to the question on the undocumented migrants, it's unfortunate that some surveillance on migrants have been linked to such points of contact with the system. And that includes money transfer. So people have developed their own sensors, if I may say. in order to just avoid such surveillance, avoid being detected by the authorities and then rounded up and subjected to some hardships, probably even put in detention, returned, forced returns, refoulement, and so on. So I always try to ask myself, why are people using, for example, the quote unquote informal means? A couple decades ago, we didn't have a solid system of hawalas that is totally outside the formal banking system. And I myself have used it. I know generations and numbers of migrants who have used it in many countries, too many countries. And it's amazing how it functions. And one of the things is that trust. It's quick, it's trusted, and I think it also uses our ways of dealings in terms of it capitalizes on our African cultures, for example, by somebody using like hand to hand or someone you know and so on. It uses the social systems that are familiar to us in order to build a business, and it's a successful business, whether it's outside or inside. I think the mainstream system is the one who needs to extend the hands and reach out and build trust with all of these quote unquote informal systems. Otherwise, they will remain as a black hole, and migrants will continue to use them because there is something in it for migrants. So I think it needs to be approached from that point of building trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you. I think your last point is extremely important, to bring them into the fold. You know, that applies not only to the undocumented migrants sending the remittances, but even those who are not sending remittances. You know, they have to be brought into the fold by not spending money on surveillance, rather spending on their education and health. And that would raise their average productivity. They would become part of the formal economy. They would pay taxes. That's where it would compensate, you know. So rather than, you know, trying to demoralize them further, it is better to earn their loyalty. Do a good deed to them and they will be loyal. That, I think, is important.
Absolutely. Iman, did you want to come back?
No, thanks. That's very thorough. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Professor Binod, Iman, and Rashid, for bringing us into those questions. We did a very interesting exercise as JRFDT while we were out at the global conference, in asking participants the word for remittances in their mother tongue. And I was actually thinking, in a way, how I wish there was a way to record people the first time you ask them a question, because for all the about 11 videos that we will be sharing in a much more structured way in the next couple of days, the first question somebody would say, but I don't have the word for remittances, you know. And we spoke to experts that have been in the sector for many, many years, and they sort of thought, but what's the word in my mother tongue? And we liked how a lot said, well, maybe let me just say it when people want to ask for money from home. And I think this, for us, as you know, a small piece of research that would actually be very interesting for us to look at, talks a lot about how conceptualization in the global space can sometimes lose the spirit of what is really happening behind. Because if we cannot even give the word for it in our mother tongue, and yet we're sending these billions to families and people receiving them. And I liked how people would just say, well, you know, we don't have the word for remittances. If somebody just wants this money, they would say this. This is what they would say. And I actually thought about it in my mother tongue. We just call it money. And so in thinking about this, we would like to take the opportunity here to ask you to go into the chat, as I will ask the next question to Professor Binod, to tell us what remittances is in your mother tongue. So I know that for English, former British colonies, we all say English is not our mother tongue. So we have to go into, then I would say, as I said to others, how does your grandmother say it? Because our grandmothers, even though they may speak English, they do go back to the very authentic way of saying something. So just in the chat, the good number of us that are in this room, you would just write how you say remittances in your mother tongue. And I apologize if our computers rather don't have the alphabet that's there in our mother tongue languages, but it would still be interesting to tell us how you say it, and just tell us please where it's from. So you could say the word, for instance, in Swahili, you would say hela zinazotumika kutoka nje ya nchi, and then I would say Swahili Tanzania. So we can remember as we save the chat where it's coming from. And in my mother tongue in Zambia, you would say Mali Azwagunze, which you would then translate into Tonga, Zambia. So we're able to position the language and the country, because usually remittances is really about those family connections. We also like that a lot of people related remittances to the word love and care. So all these things that people also substituted, and that in their mother tongue, it really sounded more of responsibility, rather sometimes as what we would see in the global space of contribution to the SDGs. And people would say, oh, wow, that's a big, bold one. This money is actually used to pay school fees for the child at school. So it is quite interesting. So on that note, as people are digesting and thinking what remittances is in your mother tongue, I would just ask Professor Binod, and we'll take a few more minutes to just take us now to the receiving side, Professor Binod, the 1 billion people, members of people's families. What do these remittances really mean for them in terms of transforming their lives and making it through to contributing to personal SDGs?
Yes, absolutely. When you were speaking, I was still trying to figure out what be the word in my language, and it's difficult for me to point out now what is my mother tongue, because I was born in a family which had its mother tongue. You can call it Hindi or Rajasthani, but I've grown up in an environment where I'm equally entitled to call Assamese as my mother tongue. But and I have friends in Bengal or from Bengali origin, and so I'm equally, comfortable in speaking in Bengali. But I'm at a loss as to what would be the appropriate word for remittances. Certainly, it's not remittances; it's something else, which probably is not one word. It's perhaps a description of paisa. Paisa is money. Paisa aaya ki nahi. Whether the money came or not, that's the conversation. Whether you have sent the money or not, or I have sent the money. When I was in Singapore, I used to find a lot of people were going to a particular shop to send their money. It's a huge, mega store called Mustafa's, and it was started by a migrant worker from Hyderabad, India, who was a street vendor, and who has become a multi-billionaire now, and running this store is open 24/7, and they have a remittance unit where they give you the best rates. We are talking about cutting down the remittance transaction cost. You should go to Mustafa. You will get the best of them, and there are other private ones around that area who, because of the competition from Mustafa, their rates are also not very high. So, this is the market that drives the remittances. And this is where the lingua franca is developed. We have to spend time there and listen and ask people what have they sent. They will not say remittances, they will call it something else. That's very important. But having said that, in terms of the billion people that were mentioned, who are the receivers of this money, in terms of their life, it has made difference in different walks of their own life. In terms of housing is one, which is very much visible in India. Again, the housing investment of remittances in housing has its pluses and minuses, because it divides the society, it divides the community, it finds parts of the villages or the towns, which are receiving the migrants' remittances are well developed in terms of having flashy houses, but the other part which is not receiving them are still in poverty. So you find that that divide is increasing and that is creating tensions. That's there. But and kind of housing, there's no guidelines on that. What kind of housing should be developed? Whether you want, meet your needs, or you want to have, demonstration effect of showing other people that you have large house. That I think needs guidance. That's where the investment of its resources needs to be taken care of. They don't have those agencies. Other examples of these going into wrong channels and wrong expenditure is dowry. The marriage, the wedding of the Indian or even in South Asian societies is that there are ills of this practice of dowry, which had started in terms of inheritance of the property by the girl child, but it got distorted and has become a point of negotiations between the families who are getting tied through through the matrimonials. So that's where it becomes exploitative in terms of policy, in terms of demand, all those kind of things. So that's where I think it is important to also look at these million people, how they are spending this money, whether it is helping them in looking after the elderly in terms of their health, in terms of their medication, and so on. Is it helping them in the education of the children till they are able to earn themselves or not? Or are they the siblings' education? Is it going there? So those are the, and there may be many other avenues which we do not know about unless we actually make an effort to know them. So that I think is extremely important. I think the larger majority is benefiting from remittances, but there is a small minority which are actually creating tensions and going in wrong kinds of investments. That I think is very important to be looking into. But your point, Paddy, about the mother tongue, the word in the mother tongue, it leads me to think about the language of communication. Language of communication among the researchers, who are we? We are social scientists. We are not scientists. I will say, well, scientists are also important. At least I think perhaps if you look at who is sending the maximum remittances, perhaps it would be the pure scientists who are, making the best of their opportunity of being employed in destination countries, and their savings are perhaps higher, and then they are able to send more. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this work that the social scientists were doing on remittances or on migration in general. What language, what terminology, what jargons are they using? I think we are falling apart. We are losing the identity of the social scientists. We are acquiring the identity of being an economist or a sociologist or an anthropologist or a political scientist, a historian, a lawyer, and so on. Why are we not building bridges across our disciplines and speak in the same language? And I would rather put the blame on my own clan of economists who use a completely different mathematical language, which creates fear, if not envy, among others. So I think we need to take care of that when you are talking of the role of scientists, researchers, and so on, and civil society, because the civil society does not understand this language, the jargonistic language. That has to be brought down to the level of being communicated to this type of partners. Having said that, I wanted to say something which perhaps will come back to my mind once we carry on this conversation further.
No, it's very interesting, and I'm just also looking into the chat. Manjima, did you want to come in? I see you made a very interesting remark. Manjima, feel free to speak.
Yeah, sure. So since we were talking about the importance of having a term, having a name so that we understand what is happening, I was also thinking how once we move out of the academia, it might not always be necessary to have a term for it, but people often understand the concepts in their own unique ways. So coming from Kerala, which is a state that has historically seen high rates of immigration to the Gulf countries, I always remember since childhood we have been exposed to the movies and songs which depicted these migrants working hard to earn their money and sacrificing a lot of things so that they could go abroad and take care of their family well. So we have, while there is no specific term that I can recollect, I remember the concept is something that has been very vividly portrayed through these movies and depictions and scores of books and even the personal conversations you have with people who have been abroad. So that's again why this brings back to the topic, the point that Professor Khaja was just mentioning about the necessity of creating bridges between academia and the everyday life, which is why I think it's important for these discussions to happen so that it's not just academia in a high tower writing papers in isolation, but also we taking up concepts from the everyday quotidian life and this becoming a cycle that goes forward and creating dialogues. Yeah.
I think
Professor
it's very
Vinod,
important
your reflection.
yeah, what Manjua has raised the issue is very important. It reminds me of the popular saying about what's in a name after all. So that's what we have to think.